But that's a whole other story. I will now be quiet.
I didn't actually finish my question, Mr. Bennett. It's quick. It's a little naive if I just finish that real quick. Your overall thesis that the source of the marginalization of Reich and psychoanalysis is basically his politics?
Well, you see that quote from Anna Freud. She didn't say his sexual theories, she said his political activities.
Yeah, she's quoting Freud.
She said, my father wants to get rid of Reich. He doesn't want psychoanalysis to be banned in Germany.
Okay, just want to make sure I wasn't missing.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think you should, I mean, it's possibly Dr. Lothane or some of the others who commented. You have to, in light of the issue of, the negotiations with the Nazis about, preserving psychoanalysis or the dejudification of the analytic movement in Germany and ultimately Austria. It was also very, Jung and Jung's circle was also very active in Germany, and many of the people who took leadership positions were associates of Jung. And it's very clear that Jung probably himself, at least in my view, based on my reading, was a Nazi collaborator.
Certainly,
well, anti-Semitic for sure. It is interesting that Freud, I was thinking of this in one of the earlier presentations, that Freud, initially idolized Jung because he was Aryan, and he was such a handsome and pure and outstanding Aryan figure. So I mean, I think there's a lot of issues around this whole issue, and Reich represented everything that Reich moves in the direction that he moves in, just as we know from a number of Freud's personal writings in his journals, that he wanted psychoanalysis, he felt psychoanalysis was about to become acceptable, was finally beginning to be embraced by the general, intelligentsia and public, and this was not a time to allow what he called the kindergarten, and that meant not just Reich, but a number of others to become the dominant representatives, and they were very popular. They were rock stars. I mean, from all accounts, public lectures of Reich were attended by hundreds of young people who were very even young Nazis evidently. They were allowed to come in as long as they checked their guns at the door. So I think it has to. I'm always, and I thought that Dr. Lothane's point is to look at this in context in terms of what was really going on, at this time. This was not just some minor intellectual argument. This was major world drama, and that Reich was at the center of it.
One question, just on your comment, because I've heard you say it before. I'm just curious, what evidence do you have that Jung was a Nazi collaborator?
Well, among other things, is the fact that I think there was actually a membership card.
So he was a member of the Nazi Party?
Yeah, they argue, his supporters argue, maybe others can comment, his supporters argue that he did that simply as a way of, preserving the safety of his associates in Berlin, because he was in Switzerland.
He explains, he gives his explanation of his own autobiography.
Right.
He says that he accepted to be editor of the journal because he was afraid of what they might put in there on somebody else's leadership.
Right.
Wait, say that again?
He accepted, he was offered the editorial directorship of the Nazi psychology journal.
Okay.
I don't know the details. And he decided to accept it because he saw that Nazism was very dangerous, had dangerous consequences. And he thought at least if Jung was in control of the editorial policy, it would be so bad.
So, okay, so was he
He
also
was
trying to save his
He was
ass?
in Switzerland, right?
Yeah. Zurich.
I mean, that's what he wrote about.
Right, but was it in his own self-interest to protect himself, or did he actually
Well,
have an alliance, and did he believe and have a, was he an alliance
says that
with them?
it was to modulate or moderate the possible
we know
dangerous
his,
effects of Nazi
Okay.
psychology and propaganda.
we know his views, you know, were not exactly friendly to,
It's just a little unclear.
you know,
Unclear.
Yeah, okay.
Well, there's two different issues, namely, did he express in his writing anti-Semitic statements, and I think he did. Whether or not he joined the party and what motivated him for doing it, who knows? But, I mean, I don't know. I don't know. But he certainly said things in his writings about the Aryan race and about the others, and these
Right.
guys know it better than I.
I can suggest to you some literature.
Okay, sure, thank you.
One is by Maidenbaum and Mike Adams, who lives in New York, who trace the whole chronology of what you did in this book. The other one is another source, just throw it in my mind. I have to reassociate together.
Okay, it'll come.
It's in your
I can hatch it out.
It's in your
Yes, I used to possess a book which was a collection of Nazi propaganda, and it showed how there was propaganda for each level, intellectual level, and so on. There was a Jungian analyst. He said, "Why do I come to you tonight in the uniform of the brown shirts?" It is because we must save the psychoanalysis from being a perverse Jewish enterprise, and so forth. So Jung, whatever Jung did, the Jungians, a number of Jungians were actual Nazis.
the president of the guy who becomes the president of the,
If any of you know the name of that book, it's called Nazi Propaganda.
All right, I remember the detail. It has to do with Jung collaborating with the Goering Institute. And what he said there were things sympathetic towards the Wotan idea and the Aryan idea, which he got from Hitler's Mein Kampf. So it was mostly playing with these ideas. There is another view by Dietrich Baer, who wrote a biography of Jung in 2003, who said they were actually collaborating on the American No, the American government was an agent of the CIA. So, go figure.
yeah. That's always a safe, at that time it would have been the CIA, it would have been the OSS. But, I mean, I think, yeah, we could spend an indefinite amount of time. Jung clearly was not, was not a friend of, psychoanalysis, Freudian psychoanalysis, or Judaism, or many liberal or left politics. But clearly, I mean, among other things, the Jungians basically took over the leadership of the German, psychiatric and psychoanalytic movement. And remained in close collaboration with him. Rather than, that wasn't exactly the subject of the. Yeah, you had a question earlier on.
I've forgotten it.
You forgot it.
Write it down.
No, I wanted to pursue the questions of
Ambivalence.
interpretations.
Let me speak to that. So the issue was
Decisions on when to interpret.
when to interpret.
And Wright's ambivalence for the language here.
I'm sorry?
He put off his interpretation
Right, that's
for a
right.
year for whatever
Well,
reason.
right, according to, my argument was that according to the old theory that was superseded by the structural theory, one would do what the people who were attending the conference where this was discussed were telling Wright to do, which is if a patient has an incest dream, even if it's on day one, you interpret the incest dream. And that's what Freybairn said, and that's what Hitchman said, and that's what Munber said, and that's what Freud said. But Wright's point of view was that the patient has to be ready for the interpretation. commemorative affect. So if somebody tells me a dream, and I think that there's an incest content in it, how do I know that it's going to touch a chord or strike a chord with the patient? And that's where the structural theory comes in. Because according to the structural theory, one has a notion of how their ego has developed and what the defenses are.
Hello?
I don't know if anybody's having trouble hearing.
You sound great.
So one has to have a notion of what the defenses are against that content. So the key thing is not the idea. We can all go to an analyst and say, well, I have incestuous wishes towards my mother or father, whatever. That doesn't help very much. What helps is that over a period of time, one can actually see that as a child one might have had those feelings and all the associated memories and feelings that go with that. And so when one develops a sense of the actual structure of the ego. And at this early date, which is November 23, Wright was really alone, I think, practically, in saying, look, you can't just interpret willy-nilly. Just because somebody says something, you can't interpret because you don't know how it's going to strike the patient, if it's going to mean anything to them.
Right.
And that's why I waited a year. So there has to be a certain amount of working over the material, what he called a Verarbeitung, working over.
I appreciate
And what that means is sort of processing it.
Yes.
And working, because the issue for Wright always
with the ego. So the ego could profit from the interpretation later on.
The key thing was that Wright was really he was using the old cathartic idea, meaning that symptoms and resistances and character structure and so forth come because we have memories, unconscious memories and affects that we're not in touch with. And in a hysteric, let's say a traumatic hysteria, the person remembers it and there's a catharsis and their symptom is gone. But in a character neurotic, as he was saying, we can work for years and years and years, and they free associate, and they don't get better. So what's the difference is that there has to be a preparation of, and that's where preparation of the ego, and that's where Reich's idea of consistent resistance analysis comes from, and which later culminates in character analysis.
Let me just add, as the only actively practicing orgonomist on the panel, although others have worked as organomically, it finally goes further. In my experience, when treatment is successful and the patient, when the blocks have been resolved, and these are terms that would not be accepted, I guess, it's hollow. But when the patient is open, often we get, Wright talks about this later, spontaneous memory sometimes, and in fact, you get situations where patients interpret on their own the material, without lo and behold, without the therapist needing to intervene, and then the therapist can often be very useful in being supportive and being very, in a sense, nurturant of what they've come to understand. But it has a very, very different effect when it comes that way, as opposed to being it doesn't matter what kind of therapy you do, as opposed to being in early training and having someone present something and going through the interpretation right away because you know it's exactly right, and the patient looks at you and says, or you're crazy, or that's very interesting, and it means nothing.
Now, I wanted to raise, to bring back the discussion to Wright as an analyst.
Well, I'm going to just,
Should I quote Wright?
no, because one comment, you said it, or someone said, you don't know what Wright was like as an analyst.
Okay, this will
You
get
said
us into that, yes.
Yeah, I want to,
But I want to frame it this way. The whole question of what interventions Wright was using that we would consider non-analytic at that time and even now, and to what extent the field of psychoanalysis has moved in the direction of sanctioning, so to speak, non-analytic techniques. I mean, there is the concept of introducing parameters, which is one thing that has become standard, but there's also the idea of educating the patient, preparing the patient for analysis. And I think Wright was one of the pioneers, probably, in instituting so-called educational measures in making the patient ready for the real analysis. But then there comes the whole question of, at what point working with the body becomes so non-analytic that you can no longer conduct the analytic part. And then one of the things I cut out from my talk because of time was this very, very interesting part of the chapter on the masochistic character, where Wright is trying to work analytically with his patient, and all the patient does, session after session, week after week, is to complain and cry and throw fits and so forth and so on. So what does Wright do? Wright couldn't get any free associations to work with, so he starts imitating the patient. And at one point, whenever the patient answers his interpretation, he repeats the answer to show him how absurd it is. And at one point, Wright describes that he gets on the floor and he starts kicking and screaming, imitating the patient's tantrum. So I raised the question, at what point does it become impossible, really, with that kind of active intervention, whether of the imitative kind, or the challenging kind, or of the educational indoctrination kind, or of the physical touching kind? At what point does it make analysis impossible? In other words, impossible to go on getting associations and early memories and doing reconstruction of the patient's past. Now, in the case of the masochistic patient, Wright was successful, and you have to hand it to him. But who besides Wright was doing that kind of thing, and who besides Wright could have done it with success that he had? Can it be generalized to our field, and is it something that we have now recognized as necessary? And where do you draw the limits?
Well, first I'd like to add a point to what Jonathan was saying before, that to say that you have an incestuous wish sounds like an intellectualized phrase. An intellectualization is not going to get you anywhere. You have to make an emotional contact with the patient. So defense is an activity which you can observe. You have to be able to describe how the patient is defending against his own ideas. And this is what Wright does. So the technique here, which is compatible with psychoanalysis, is confrontation, which is, traditionally we talk about clarification, confrontation, and interpretation, and the interpretation is supposed to be the pinnacle of the edifice. No, not so. It's anything which helps to open the patient up and to see more emotion is the proper analytic procedure.
What brings up for me is where it becomes
A little louder.
where it becomes not so much incompatible, but two different ways of approaching. It seems as if you're not proceeding.
It's also a psychosomatic concept of the unity of body and mind. And so the energetics includes much more than energy per se. And the point is again to mobilize the emotions, to bring them out into the open. So anger should be expressed, and my technique is also always to say to the patient, if you want to make me happy, tell me how angry you are. And don't conceal anything, just lay it all out. And no matter how much you encourage, they still hold back. So what Wright is doing is exposing, withholding patterns to the patient. And it is then when you get the genuine association. The other point would be to add it also to why is it told to me now at this time and for what purpose? What does the patient want from me? Why are you telling me this? To me, that's always the crux of that. It's not just, oh, I remember how my father was doing this and that. But what does it mean when you're telling me about this now? Same thing about interpreting a dream. Why are you telling me the dream today? What does it mean to bring this today into the session?
So, first question, what was Wright like as a psychoanalyst? There is at least one report. An American who's from Maine, his name was English, O. Spurgeon English, published an article, I think in the 70s, about his treatment with Wright in 1929, 1930. Now that's before Wright starts doing some, but he does talk about Wright imitating his expression and things of that sort. So you can read that article, and maybe you already read it, I forgot. Oh, I'll get it to you. Yeah. The second thing is, if character analysis can be understood as embodying psychoanalysis in some sense, I mean, if it is in that tradition, it's important to remember that when Wright moved to, quote, the body, and I hate talking like that because it's dualistic, it was character analytic vegetal therapy. That is, I would argue that the therapy that he was developing in Oslo, though you would not call it psychoanalysis, still had within it seeds as found in his character analytic work that was psychoanalytic in nature. You know, he does say beyond psychology, he's moving beyond some kind of mental stuff, but what he's doing, and I think to some degree what organ therapists do, at least some of them, is character analysis as well as...
It incorporates all of the above.
You could formulate it in terms of emphasis, shift of emphasis, but do you think there's any value in the formulation that I made in what I said in my talk, namely that in some sense Wright was developing a form of resistance analysis which was both psychic and somatic,
Absolutely.
vegetative at the same time?
Absolutely.
And if so, what justification does he have in all of those footnotes? Maybe there's only a couple of footnotes in the third edition of Character Analysis where he says that psychoanalytic work is no longer necessary now that we have
I think to some extent, since I've just been recently teaching that, I think some of those footnotes are somewhat, defensive and somewhat positional because he knows what's coming at him. I would add that Wright was famous for saying, in numerous places, that if a patient came in and you hit him on the head with a hammer and it all came together, that's what you would do, and that would be fine. So that in the final stage, he would.
Yeah, but the hammer my understanding is that the hammer would have to be established.
Yes, as long as it works, he said, it would be fine. And his position would be, from what I understand,
That's what works.
Is what works, and that finally it wasn't. He also said, in addition to saying that he remained a Marxist, he also said, there are some very good psychoanalysts who can establish the orgasm reflex. It doesn't have to be done my way, and he was very clear. He clearly said that. He said it really has to do with what your goal is and what you're after, not specifically whether you use this technique or that technique. And to the end, there's the famous, in one of the seminars, the doctors started getting into character analytic analysis of cases that are being presented, and he's very quiet and he gets very angry and he says, you want a character analysis of this patient? And he goes through this, Dr. Sophie went through this absolutely meticulous character analytic analysis. And he said, you know why? Because I created that technique, and I can do it, but that's not what we're about. We're about what is really happening to the patient, not about whether you can analyze it carefully and analyze it,
Right,
you
so
know, accurately.
he had shifted his theoretical position.
The key here, I think you have to, the key here you have to accept is that, and I wanted to make that point, I noticed in almost all the presentation. Reich's position is very clear. It is not that psyche and soma are linked. It is that they are identical. That it is a total social construct to even consider psyche and soma as separate, entities. Now, as separate experiences is a different, that you experience it differently is existentially inevitable. But that in fact for Reich, and if there is a distinction between character analytic vegetotherapy and what becomes origami, they were just dealing with this in Norway because they want to know, they do character analytic vegetotherapy. They want to know what's origami, why is it so different? The difference is that by the time it comes to the orgonomic formulation, it is no longer an issue of psyche and soma as being addressed in separation. It is functionally a whole, and you go wherever it takes you, and you follow it in the same way you follow any other path that leads to success.
Can I add something here, clarification?
Yeah.
I knew Weitzner in Israel, and I knew about his treatment methods as an organologist. There was no talk. There was only trying to loosen the muscular armor, and it was trying to irradiate all kinds of tubes that contain energy. The character analytic technique, per se, in terms of Reich's character armor, is to point out to patients the rigidities, whether they're found in the arms or the legs or the neck. And when these rigidities that are pointed out, when the patient lets go, all of a sudden he's flooded with emotion and with further associations. This is the character analytic technique. In addition to this, is it in the function of an orgasm, where he has a description of the treatment of a schizophrenic moment?
Part 3.
That's character.
So this is a whole case that he describes over many pages. We should look at that case and get some idea of what he does as an analyst at that point.
I think it's very accurate. There's also another, for anyone who's in, there is another Hamilton who ran the Hamilton School against Reich's orders, kept a journal of his orgone treatment with Reich, and was published in the journal, American College Journal of Orgonomy.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting. By my accounts from people who knew Reich and were in treatment with Reich, is he could do any of the above. Basically consistent with exactly what Dr. Lothane is saying and what Dr. Koblenzer is that there were times that he would operate character analytic, he would go to a character analytic position. There were times he would say, I don't want you to say a word. And the other thing, by the way, just quickly, he did not have a 45-minute or 50-minute hour. You could come in and it could be 10 minutes. He'd say,
It was the first Lothanian.
yeah, but he would say, that's enough, that's all I want to do today, let's listen to Mozart. He's got a controller. Or he'd come in, he might stay with you for an hour and a half because he felt it was crucial, and he would tell his next patient you'd have to wait.
Well, but that raises the whole question of transference. Is transference no longer necessary as a vehicle of treatment?
It's a tool. Well, it's a tool. There is no such thing as no transference. There is always a transference.
Right, but there's such a thing as not using it or not analyzing it.
Well, if the first point that Reich makes is that no patient can follow the basic rule of analysis, because there's no reason for the patient to walk in and trust the analyst. He would be crazy if he did. And he wants to understand the analyst first before he's going to reveal himself. And through the as you say, the negative transference is essential, because there's a reason the person is protecting themselves. And that has to be done. So whatever you do, you're going to have to analyze and use the transference.
Absolutely. But don't forget that one of the biggest fights was over and that didn't get talked about that much here, is one of the big fights was whether Reich's position was very clear that you cannot have a successful treatment that doesn't present always with negative transference first. And there were arguments in the seminars, in the technical seminars, saying, that's not true. My patients love me. I have patients who tell me that they love
Can I make a
me.
suggestion? Negative transference is a phrase that should be avoided. Instead of this, you should say anger at the analyst.
Yeah.
Anger, contempt, derision, mocking,
Yeah.
and all these emotions kept secret from the analyst and really not being candid and voicing them.
Yes, I think when Reich went to orgonomy, he abandoned the issue of negative transference. Not abandoned, but moved much more in that direction.
I mean, this was supposed to be the learned expression, and positive transference was simply a four-letter word, love.
I had the opportunity to interview Dr. Herskowitz, who was Dr. Reich's last patient, who's currently alive and last trainee. And he told me that Reich had told him that in the future there'll be no talking in therapy. And so I asked Dr. Herskowitz, well, really, how is this supposed to be therapy? And Dr. Herskowitz told me, well, he didn't believe that could possibly be the case, but for whatever reason, I felt that. I agree wholeheartedly that there's always transference, not just in the psychoanalytic or therapeutic context, there's always transference, and the treatment setup is designed to make use of it. And I'm just thinking that it would be a completely arbitrary cutoff between, character and analytic vegetative therapy on the one hand versus psychotherapy, or character analytic vegetative therapy and organ therapy. It's strictly arbitrary cutoffs. But the issue surely is, how does the transference enter into the therapeutic transaction? And I guess over time, Reich felt more and more that it would be expressed in physical ways, or ways that he could understand in the physical context.
So, but you see, when you say transference, the classical thing is that you act out of the analyst something from your past.
Right.
But before you get to that, my position is, first, give full attention to this as an interaction in this moment and nothing else. The patient wants something from you and says to me, give me this. So first I have to confront it as a dramatic happening right now. Why does he do it to me? What am I doing in response? What are his emotions or her emotions and my emotions?
But I'm betting you are already thinking in terms of transfer.
No, I'm not. I simply want to stay with what's happening in the here and now, at this moment, in this place, with this person, and with me.
Okay.
What was said, what was exchanged, what emotions went into it, what was not just transfer, but it was a transfer of emotion, because emotions are contagious. If somebody's happy, I'm happy. If somebody's sad, I'm sad. If somebody's tense, I feel the tension in me. At one point, the patient was telling me something about his life, and I had tears in my eyes. He said, why are you crying? I said, I'm crying for you. So when you exhaust everything in the here and now, then you say, maybe there's something from the past that's coming. There's a first approach.
I wanted to say something about this no talking business. From what you reported from Walter Hoppe and what Jonathan reports from his interview with Dr. Herskowitz. It could be that Reich said that to Herskowitz and not to anyone else. In other words, Reich had this rule, as Harry Lewis has often reminded me, that the therapists were not supposed to talk to one another. Of course they did after Reich died.
About their therapy.
Yeah, but of course, it may be different for different people. And secondly, you remind me of something. I remember once having a session with Sobi where I never got to breathe. And all we did was talk, and I felt so cheated. Now, I didn't get to do the real stuff, but of course, the talk was very, very important. So it seems to me there's going to be times when you're just going to breathe, and you're going to do the work, and there's going to be, well, that particular kind of work, and there's going to be times when you do other kinds of work. But to make a rule, no talking.
Let me just speak. Dr. Wright told, it's also on cassette, in one of the seminars, when he developed the
medical doorbuster.
Medical doorbuster, he said to them, he hopes that this would get us away from having to talk and deal with the transference. He then proceeded to experiment with and use it, and he came back in and said, it brings up even more transference. You know, he said, because once you get things, and he was clear, he said, once you get things moving, and I think that's exactly as Dr. Lothane is saying, it's all there, and it's not theoretical.
Yeah, let me mention one more person who used this technique. It was Helen Flanders Dunbar at Columbia, who wrote about psychosemantics in the 50s. And she described, for example, a case of a patient with rheumatoid like
Arthritis.
Arthritis and contractions. And she showed her how to relax and how to loosen up. And then a flood of emotions came out, including memories. So that at that point, the emotional contact with the past goes back to the cathartic method.
Yes. As Dr. Sobi once wonderfully described, working with a patient, and he went to Dr. Wright, and Dr. Wright observed the patient, and Sobi said, the guy's clear, his respiration is full, everything, he seems to be fine, but something is just not happening. Wright worked with him for a little while, and Wright was evidently quite exceptional at this, and walked over to him and grabbed his little toe, which had been curled up and holding onto the sheet, and he just grabbed it, and the guy went ballistic and went into a rage, you know. And Sobi then said, "How did I miss that?" He said, "Because he was hiding it from you. This wasn't. You could then go into issues of transference. The issue was transference is always there. People find very amazing ways of hiding or protecting themselves. And I think one of the things that Wright was saying is, part of this whole thing about acting out, imitating, using different things, anything that you can get, but the issue is what are you going for? And I think as Dr. Koblenzer is also saying, what you're going for is getting through to the core so that you can begin to help them individually be built. Not so that we can theoretically prove the existence of a particular point.
The other point to understand is that using words like resistance and transference with the patient is very often a cover-up of the analyst who doesn't know what to do, so he grabs at straws.
I'm thinking we're going to probably have to, 4:30 is, if there's,
I have one more comment. Which is something that's never mentioned. And certainly Wright would disagree with what I'm about to say. But
we'll have to challenge it.
the intellectual atmosphere or background or ambiance in the 19th century was very influenced by Schopenhauer. And Schopenhauer, among others. And Schopenhauer's very crudely put theory is this. That the subjective, if we are living systems, and we are made out of the same matter that rocks and stars and so forth are, we have this noumenal experience, this subjectivity, and that subjectivity is a characteristic of matter, arranged in a certain way, so that the soma and the psyche can't be separated. So,
I think Wright was very aware of Schopenhauer. I mean, I think, clearly, and I think they were all very, very deeply Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, the ultimate combination. And then add a little bit of Lenin and Marx, and then you really got Groucho.
John and Groucho.
The questions that were being touched on at the end there, I think in terms of a Reichian perspective, what brings it all together is energy. You know, whether you're talking about transference or resistances or whatever, once you have energy, you know, I mean, think of water if you can't think of energy, and transference, distribution of energy into the toe. Where is it going? How do you concentrate it? How do you discharge it? All those things intersect in the energy. That's why I think that's the big difference. And, you know, the psychoanalysis gave it up when they gave up the libido, but you know, right then concretized it in the orgo. That's I think that's a big distinction that brings it all together.
No, but that's what Reich says in his footnotes of 1945. He says that the reason he's not that concerned anymore about the psychological complexes and the psychic resistances is the quantitative, because the quantity of energy that can be liberated in the muscular armor, for example, is much, much greater than what you can liberate through analyzing an Oedipus complex. But did he prove that? And what did he lose when he gave it up? Because if you really believe in the functional identity of psyche and soma, why should you favor the soma over the psyche just because of a quantitative estimate?
The big question is whether he gave it up.
That's the question.
Yeah,
That's the question. I'm not saying.
And based on, I think even based on the comment about.
But his footnotes are tangential.
Yeah. Based on the comment of Dr. Koblenzer coming from Dr. Hersowitz, is right to say these things and then often act and proceed very, very differently.
The other question is, if you are abandoning free association as your central method of ferreting out resistances, are you now relying totally on intuition? And there's no doubt that Reich was one of the most intuitive therapists ever. But or is there another?
That doesn't matter.
Is there another?
But the next psychoanalyst would have to invite a group of organoists here to present it.
But the start is the energy. There was only
Yes, the start is the energy, but then there's the question of his technique.
Eric, so can I rephrase the question?
This will be the last rephrasing.
Can we
Dr.
get
Koblenzer has to
away
leave. I just want to quickly thank everybody for coming. I'll let you know that thank Dr. Koblenzer and the Ph.D. has to rush out. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Michael.
The question, energy is fine, but can we ever get rid of psychology? And my answer is no.
So on that note, maybe we have to end it. So, thank the presenters who gave wonderful and exciting and challenging presentations, and a lot of stuff to learn.